and tales of Kent, full of folklore, mythology and history of this great county. When I was a child, I lived in Rainham, just over the North Downs. We often used to come to Maidstone, maybe on a little shopping trip. And what I found was, as you went down Boxley Road, you'd get to these massive prison walls, these looming Gothic walls. And I was always surprised when I was like 5, 6, 7, there was no like rope being thrown over the side. You'd look at vans sitting next to it and think, are they plotting an escape? So this is a tale, a season of prison stories, and this one's a grim one. Francis Turner would meet a William Kidder in 1867. They fell very much in love and soon had a child. Shortly afterwards, they married. And it was then that Francis learned that William had had a child from a previous relationship called Louisa. And Francis was not best pleased. Frances Kidder visited her own parents in New Rumney, and she took Louisa with her. However, when Kidder's parents returned that evening, they found that Louisa wasn't there. And they asked her, and she said, Kidder that is, that she'd gone for a walk with the child, and then a horse had startled them both, and poor Louisa had fallen in a ditch and drowned. Her own father and mother didn't believe her. Her father called the police. They arrested her, and when she was in custody, she confessed as to where the body of the child would be found. A search was accordingly made, and in a ditch in a field called Cobb's Field, about a quarter of a mile from the residence of the prisoner's father and mother, the dead body of the poor child was discovered. There were marks as of a struggle having taken place on the bank of the ditch, and it appeared that the water was not more than a foot deep, so that the suggestion on the part of the prosecution was that if there had been any foundation for the assertion of the prisoner that the child had fallen into the ditch accidentally, she could easily have extricated herself, and that the more reasonable conclusion to be arrived at was that the unhappy child had been forced violently into the ditch and held under the water until she was suffocated. During her trial, witnesses, including her own mother, father, husband and sister, gave damaging evidence about her hatred for Louisa. The Standard once again reports, the prisoner was a woman of violent temper, and there seemed to be very little doubt that she entertained a great antipathy to her stepdaughter, the unfortunately deceased, and it was proved that she frequently beat her very cruelly, her pinafore and other articles of clothing being seen on several occasions covered with blood, and she was also represented to have made use of deadly threats towards the poor child, and particularly that she would take her out and drown her. It took the jury just 20 minutes to find her guilty. Lloyd's Illustrated of London said that when the verdict was announced, she expressed no emotion at all. The judge sentenced her to death. When Kidder was in jail, she sent numerous letters to her husband asking to see him. And nearing the date of her death and execution, he came to see her. What happened was a massive row, as Kidder had found out that her husband was now hooked up with her 17-year-old sister. The row was so vicious and fierce that the Reverend Fraser felt he had to intervene and chastised William Kidder for his behaviour, and it would seem that he took those words to heart. Well, it seemed that he'd actually taken them to heart, but hours before Frances Kidder's execution, her husband could be found in a nearby pub, possibly this one, with his daughter, their daughter, laughing about his wife's coming demise. It was said that when Frances Kidder made her way to the scaffold outside Maidstone Prison, she had to be escorted by 2 prison officers as she'd become hysterical. Her last words, in front of a crowd of some say 3,000 to 4,000, including possibly her husband and her sister, now living together, were said to be, "Lord Jesus, forgive me." She was executed by William Calcraft. He adopted the short drop method, which meant the prisoner would not fall far and would be instead slowly strangled to death, and at times he himself had to grab their legs to hasten the prisoner's demise. So it was that Frances Kidder spent 2 minutes choking, kicking, dangling to death outside Maidstone Prison. She goes down as history as the last woman to be executed publicly in Britain. So who was this executioner William Calcraft? Well, Thomas Hardy had written a story called The Three Strangers, where he described a character who looked a lot like William Calcraft, and Hardy would know because he'd seen Calcraft at work when he'd executed a Martha Brown. He described his character in the book as looking like his hair being slightly frosted, his eyebrows bristly, and his whiskers cut back from his cheeks. His face was rather full and flabby, and yet it was not altogether a face without power. Calcraft was an interesting character. He'd risen up as a cobbler and had happened to have met the chief executioner, John Foxton. They became friends, and Foxton introduced him to the world of criminal punishment. So it was that Calcraft started off flogging prisoners and then moved on later to executing them. As an executioner, Calcraft would execute over 450 people, including 37 here at Maidstone Prison. Calcraft was known to sell the rope from which he'd hung prisoners. This was known to have medicinal purposes. I don't know what you do with it, probably make it into tea or something. But this is possibly where we get the phrase money for old rope. He was also able, after the execution, to keep all the possessions of the deceased culprit. He often sold these to Madame Tussauds, where they'd be displayed in the Chamber of Horrors. Calcraft had experienced criticism before. When he had executed somebody previously, he allowed a local to go up to the dead prisoner and place the dead arm against his face, for he was hoping to remove a boil. Local people were disgusted and called on the sheriff to do something. The sheriff chastised William Calcraft and said to him, "You're here to execute people, not to cure them." A month after Francis Killer's execution, William Calcraft executed a Michael Barrett, who was the last person to be killed outside, publicly executed in Britain. There'd been increasing pressure on the government to stop public executions as they become scenes of bawdy drunkenness, surrounded by thousands of people having a day out watching someone die. Charles Dickens was one of a series of people who'd written letters to the government and the newspapers condemning what he saw in the crowds. He said, "No sorrow, no salutary terror, no abhorrence, no seriousness, nothing but ribaldry, debauchery, drunkenness, and flaunting vice, in 50 other shapes. It was so loathsome, pitiful, and vile a sight, that the law appeared to be as bad as he, or worse." So it was that all executions would now take place within prison walls. The first to be executed was an 18-year-old called Thomas Wells. Thomas Wells had had a bit of an argument with the master of Dover Priory Station, where he worked as a porter. Mr. Walsh, the master of the station, objected to a lot of what he saw as Thomas Wells's below-par work. He also didn't like the fact that Thomas would fire a pistol at work, which you would think would be a sacking offence. But anyway, now Thomas did not take this reprimand well. He went to his father's house, took a gun, and shot Mr. Walsh. Thomas Wells would be executed in his railway uniform, having written a letter asking for forgiveness from Mrs. Walsh. The only sign that an execution had taken place would be a black flag rising from the prison. Mr. Dickens would be particularly happy when it was observed. The town presented quite its usual appearance during the whole day. There was none of the usual exhibitions of ranting preachers, and a stranger passing through the town would not have had the slightest idea that anything extraordinary was going on. The public houses near the prison were also perfectly quiet, and not a drunken man or woman was to be seen. To this extent, the new system was undoubtedly a vast improvement upon the old one, and no doubt, whatever other changes may be made in the law, the days of public executions are finally numbered. And where was he executed? Inside Maidstone Prison, becoming the first person to be executed inside rather than outside a prison. If you've enjoyed this tale, then why not like and subscribe below. You might also find a reading list and a link to my Facebook and Twitter page. I shall see you next time for more Kentish tales and tales of Kent.